Welcome to Charting New Paths in Pre-K to 12 Education, a podcast by Solution Tree. We'll highlight the triumphs of top pre-K to 12 education leaders as they share their journey from previous challenges to their current course of action. Hear encouraging success stories from school and district leaders, teachers, and the education experts we're pleased to call our authors and associates. As their stories unfold, discover how these purpose-filled educators work collaboratively to create high levels of learning for all their students. I'm your host, Prisma Lopez-Marin. Enjoy today's episode. Hello, everyone. This is a special edition podcast episode as we'll be talking with the education leaders, past and present, from the Adlai E Stevenson High School District 125 in Lincolnshire, Illinois. They will share with us their experience with the Solution Tree, the impact of professional learning communities at work, and their success story in becoming a model PLC district. You will also gain some understanding of what it takes to sustain the PLC process from the very school and district that started it all. With us today from Adlai E Stevenson High School District is the current superintendent, Twadell, and the school's principal, Troy Gobble, joined by the district's former superintendent and our esteemed Solution Tree author and associate, Tim Kanold. Thank you, everyone, for joining me for this episode.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you. Yeah, we're glad to be here.
So as the PLC movement does continue to grow, what advice would you give schools or districts that are interested about Solution Tree resources and how to initiate the model PLC process on their campuses?
Yeah, I have a couple thoughts. At first, I'm a member of the Model PLC Review Committee, and I will say that is, I think, one of the more exciting opportunities for schools as they continue to learn about, what does it take to become a model PLC school. And we have a lot of schools who apply and they may not make, model school status in their first year, but we spend some time, we jump on a Zoom, we get on a phone call, we provide feedback, and it always turns out to be a great learning opportunity for schools. So that would be the first thing I would recommend. And then, the other is a place where the three of us frequently go is the All Things PLC website. It continues, I think, to be non-commercial, and it's just a place for resources for educators to go to see examples, to see protocols of the work that other schools are happening. So those are two things that I would point out that are available from Solution Tree. And then just as a third, and I'll be sure to email this to you, Prisma, but Stevenson continues to do site visits. We've been doing site visits for about 25 years now, since 1995. So I'll send you the dates for our site visits for the 2022-2023 school year. And each month we host a site visit. There's usually 100 to 150 folks. And we'd love to have people come and visit Stevenson and learn more about the work that we're doing.
I would totally agree with that. And, and also now when you apply to be a model school, there's 3 tiers now. So, which we think is really helpful. So there's sort of an introductory tier that if you don't feel like you quite have the data and the kind of some of the 3-year kind of evidence that you need and so on, you can apply for introductory status. And actually, we think that's a really helpful thing to do. And there's also sort of, if you've been working pretty hard at the PLC thing, you can now apply for what's called lighthouse status, and where you're really trying to reach out in your own community and strengthen other schools through your work as professional learning community. And then I do want to say I totally agree with Eric about the visit to Stevenson. The visits to Stevenson are very powerful. And in fact, I continue to promote it to this day and really do believe in it. But I would also, I have to tell you, and maybe it's because we're coming post-COVID, but we had 2 events last week and it was electric. The PLC Institute as an event to bring a team to is incredible. The electricity, the learning that goes on, the opportunity to begin to shape perhaps your important group of community stakeholders, your guiding coalition, or whatever you call it, into next step action that takes you where you're currently at and helps you set some short-term and perhaps long-term action plans and goals, outcomes for the future, I think can be really, really helpful. And you get access, I think, to people who have really experientially lived through this, as we have, and so, to me, that can be a very powerful thing. There's enough events that there's some, certainly something near you perhaps. So I would encourage that as well. So, we get asked a lot this on the road, and that is, okay, if we're starting from scratch, where should we start? And from your leadership perspective, what would you guys say?
Go ahead, Troy.
So
See if our answers are the same. I have an answer.
Yeah, I think the first thing you need to do is figure out who are your true leaders in your organization, build them into a guiding coalition, a building leadership team, whatever it is you'd like to call them. Get those folks together. I think to begin by reading, learning by doing, like spend some time really figuring that book out, and then realize that that's not a checklist to become a professional learning community, that the change to become a professional learning community is all about the culture of the school. I see too many schools that try to walk their way through that book, and then they're like, well, I'm in chapter 6. Why hasn't anything happened yet? But that's not really what it is, right? It's not just doing this. It's thinking differently about how you work together. So I think that's my simple answer. Eric?
Yeah, I think that that if you're looking for an actionable piece, I really think that my answer probably for years to this question was always start with the common assessments, because it's a little bit of a Trojan horse. Because if you don't have a curriculum, then you can't do common assessments. Therefore, you'll have to start with curriculum. But if you already have curriculum, then let's just move to the common assessments so that we can begin to actually start moving that flywheel for teams. But, I do believe that, questions 1 and 2 are really the place where schools have to really center their work. And we've all been lucky enough to work with schools for a long, long time. And after a couple decades, I'll tell you, in my mind, the original sin for schools that struggle with this work is a lack of a guaranteed and viable curriculum. If there's not a common curriculum that they can all kind of point to and reach from to develop those assessments, what are we doing? I mean, it's hard to collaborate. It's hard to have interventions. It's hard to have grading. I mean, everything becomes far more difficult if there isn't that guaranteed and viable curriculum. But that exists in many places. So I think in most situations, we can dive into the deep end of the pool and begin with common assessments. I'd say they'll struggle, though, if they don't have that guaranteed and viable curriculum established. Everything falls apart without it.
And when I see schools that are really struggling, it's usually, or they're stuck, they get to the place where they're trying to make their curriculum perfect. And so they spend too much time on question 1, and they need, you can't let perfect get in the way of getting work done. Right. So let's make some choices, because if you put a bunch of math teachers, Tim, or science teachers, you put a bunch of math teachers in a room and you say, come up with the essential standards of this course. It's like an ideal gas that'll fill up the amount of space that you let it have. You could talk about that for 2 years, but in the meantime, you're not talking about students and their learning. So you have to be okay. You're going to pick a curriculum, pick these standards that are important, move on, knowing that you might come back to it.
Right.
Yeah. So I know, Eric, just as a compliment to you, there was a point, about, 3 or 4 months out where, I'm not saying anything out of school here, but where the school board basically asked me in a public meeting, my feelings about, the next transition phase. And I was pretty crystal clear about your becoming the next superintendent would be, the best thing that could happen to Stevenson, because you had lived through it, the sort of the beginning stages of it and the development of it. You understood it with incredible clarity. And the only disadvantage is that you weren't a math or science person. No, but the best part about it was that you knew what it would take, and you had the skills, like the relational skills, to do it. And what's fascinating about it for me in watching both from the outside now looking in. In fact, I've been gone 15 years. That's hard to believe, actually.
Yeah.
But watching from the outside is the continuity the two of you have brought in leadership, which not all districts get to have. So how might you speak to that?
Yeah.
But more importantly, how have you really, if you could give the podcast folks some insight that's helpful in terms of how have you been able to really sustain this? Because you've had changeover, you've had tons of people retire, people move away, new teachers are coming in. Seriously, I probably 15 years later, I might know 10% of the faculty, staff, support, all the folks,
right?
Maybe 10%.
Yeah.
So how have you been able to do that?
Yeah, that's such a good question. And obviously I'll let Troy jump in here in a minute, but I think, two things. I think, the first couple of years of being superintendent were actually pretty tough, primarily because of the economy, 2008, 2009, if folks recall the Great Recession. I mean, that ended up having a pretty significant impact on schools, and we were not immune. So we had to essentially not replace, I think it was about 30 to 40 teachers over the course of a couple of years. And, I think that for many years while Stevenson was growing, it was easy to get caught up in the growth cycle. But in those first couple of years, it was a very different, culture, because we ended up, falling, I would say, victim to a lot of the struggles that other schools have in terms of cuts and issues of finance and budgeting and all those things. So it wasn't until I think about 4 years after I became superintendent, and not coincidentally, when we hired Troy as principal and Mark Onischek as our curriculum director and Tony Reibel as our director of research and evaluation and other team members, where I feel like things really started to kind of get unstuck, if you will. And I think the most important, piece of that puzzle, Tim, is that, in our DNA as a school, we've always been a place that had this commitment to continuous improvement. And once we were able to get out of the fog of the recession and all those other, kind of inputs and asteroids that were flying in, that piece of the puzzle was always there. We have a faculty that, for the most part, is so committed to trying to be a better teacher next year than they were this year, than they were the year before, that a lot of the initiatives that we've been working on are made easier by the fact that people are willing to try new things. And not everybody, but most people are willing to try new things. And, when we roll out a new initiative and we're able to communicate in a vision of how this is going to be good for kids, I think folks have jumped on board. So, for example, I think the work over the last 10 years that has really propelled us, I think, further than we've ever been before, and was the basis for our 5th Blue Ribbon Award, was our evidence-based grading work. And, we call it evidence-based grading because we like the accent to be on the output and not the input. But I think in the educational world, we call it standards-based grading. But we really want the emphasis to be on the evidence of student learning. And that work of moving away from the traditional 100-point scale and averaging grades and all of the nonsense about zeros and late work and all of that, that was a grading practice that, was 120 years old, that we've been able to kind of move past over the last 10 years into something that we don't even use numbers anymore, right? We use descriptors, and we use a mode instead of a mean, and, just very different ways and to give kids feedback and tell them where they're at in that journey toward proficiency or mastery. But that work never would have been able to happen if it wasn't for that culture of continuous improvement that was built in. And that, that flywheel effect, that, started kind of in the 80s and slowly got moving in the 90s. And, by the 2000s, in the last 10 years in the teens, it has just been, clicking. And our job is really to try to figure out, like, are we pressing on the pedal too much or too little? How do you find that right balance between, driving too fast or driving too slow? And that, I feel like that's a big part of my job, is to support Troy and the team in figuring out, like, how, again, what's the right amount of forward momentum, because you don't want to burn people out. But Stevenson's also not a place for the faint of heart. You don't come and work here to teach the way you did 20 years ago, so People come here knowing that we're going to push them. It's a matter of figuring out how much is too much. Troy, I don't know what you think.
Oh boy, I've got all kinds. I'll start there because I was thinking a lot about when we transition people into Stevenson. Some of the best compliments that I've gotten in my time here as principal come from veteran teachers that we've hired from other school districts.
Yeah.
And when they come and spend time with us, and we have a full 3-year induction program that we do. So new teacher training is not the first 2 weeks of school. Here's where the photocopier is and the bathrooms are down the hall. Good luck. We meet over and over again for 3 full years. And I've had, pardon me, I've had many teachers who were veterans other places that said that focus showed them that our intention was you would learn and grow throughout your whole time here. We're not here. I don't want you to get better to a plateau and stay the same. I want you to keep learning and growing. So I think that new teacher program has been really important in helping that process. The other thing that jumped out at me, Eric brought up our evidence-based grading work. And what I think is so interesting about that is it's a direct follow to question 3 in the PLC process. So what are we going to do when kids struggle? And for 10 years here, we really fought how do you help a kid who has a 62%? Like, what's the solution to a kid who has a 58%, right? What do I do? And we would send them to the tutors. We would identify this kid, something's wrong. And when you would ask that student, like, well, what can't you do in math or social studies? And they would be like, I don't know. I need more points, right? I just need more whatever. And that continued conversation and frustration as we were like, how do we help each kid? How do we better identify what that is? And as soon as we realized the missing piece was the learning, like it was not about the achievement, the end grade. It was about, well, where are they in their learning process and how do we get them over? And that really tipped us into this evidence-based world where we're saying, okay, let's find some skill-based standards, identify what they are, and then provide all of our tutoring and RTI work around those standards. And when you think of it that way, what I think is so interesting, just having this conversation we sound like 3 grandpas here talking about school, but you look back at the time from when we started, it's the evolution of the work, right? And I think that's so interesting.
First of all, Troy, to what you said about that sort of natural progression forward, that's the beauty, I think, of Stevenson. I think the beauty of the culture of continuous improvement forever is that it's relative. Things you just described, we would not have been able to do yet in the 90s. We had to go through the 2000s to do, so there's, sort of immediacy of things that need to get done. And eventually, depending on where a school's at or a district's at, they can move, through these stages, that are provided and with the tools that are from learning by doing and all things PLC in different places. And even in the work that both of you do, one of the things though that, and I would say, as I was listening to you, because my background's in mathematics, I constantly teach all the districts I work with across the country when I'm doing math work. I constantly teach them about intervention has to be by standard, by child. So that the best intervention programs, you would go in and see all these tables, and the tables are by standard, and kids go get help for that standard.
Right.
But that's the best way. So hearing you say that just validates that I'm not lying. So, but Troy, my question for you deals with today, and something I'm saying that I want to know, I'd like to learn from both you and Eric how to maybe even say it better. But I'm dealing directly with all the school districts I'm in and the places that I'm working in with this incredible residue of sadness and grief and anger and fear and overwhelming being burdened by the last 2 years that COVID just sort of has put so many teachers over the edge and as well as administrators, just made their jobs almost impossible. But I'm also hearing some really success stories in districts where as COVID started to hit and we had this tremendous brutal loss of our students in March of 2020 now. And then this residue of effect for the last 2.25 years. What I'd like to know is, how would you describe, or both of you, but Troy as a principal, how has the PLC process served the tremendous stress and anxiety that teachers have had to face because of the nature of how we had to educate kids both on and off site? Like how, and we're still in it a little bit. I'm just wondering, like, how has it served? Can you kind of describe how the PLC process serves surviving and thriving despite all those obstacles that have been thrown at us the last 2 years?
Yeah, there is no doubt that the weekly team meetings that we had throughout all of this time was, it was probably what saved our group of teachers, I think, because they had time to sit down and talk about, well, what would good work look like? We spent a few months in Zoom education where we were all at home, and then a few months where we were remote, some kids in the building and some kids at home. And you could imagine with 325 teachers here at Stevenson, if every single teacher had to figure out all of the mistakes and the lessons and what works and doesn't work in either the Zoom or the hybrid space, it would take, just imagine where everyone would be. But instead, as you work together, you have these groups of teachers coming together to say, you know what, I tried this activity yesterday, and here's why it worked. Here was what was positive about it. And it really helps people. It helped us to be more nimble. The thing that I thought was most interesting for us, it was immediate. We started the school year in the beginning of this fall of 2020. We started the school year fully remote, everybody at home. And so teachers and kids, you could just imagine you've got 25 heads in the squares of the Zoom and a teacher in there, and you're trying to build a classroom culture when no one's in the same building and kids are having different interactions. And what I was most proud of our teachers in that space was really taking time, not just to get to know kids, but to really think about the social emotional needs of those students and what it meant to build a sense of belonging in class, what it meant to develop social interactions through Zoom. And that work was where I thought our collaborative nature really shone. It was amazing to hear all the different ways that our teachers worked to help kids that were all in their own bedrooms, right? You got all across, like we said earlier, 29 townships, they're all over the place. And we were able to bring those kids together and make those classes feel like a home. Just as a personal note, my daughter was a freshman last year, and there were a few times where I was in my office and I could hear her classroom going on. I have 3 kids, and all 4 of us were on the second floor of my house doing school together. Like, I was working as a principal, they were all doing school. And I could hear the kids on Adeline's Zoom laughing and giggling and interacting together like a classroom. And I remember thinking how special that was. And it was because the teachers were able to build that culture. So to me, that's the success story walking away. And I will also say that it's paid dividends, because even this year when we were all back full time, I think we're seeing our teachers pay more attention to helping all kids feel like they are included and they belong in class, spending more time talking about what does the appropriate social interaction look like. That, I think, has been really good. I love I know, Tim, this is in your world, you want people to do math together. You want them to talk about the problem solving process. You want the kids to work in groups. You want them to but working in groups doesn't mean one kid does it and the other kids follow along, right? And I think teaching kids how to interact in those situations is something we've gotten much better at because of the space in the pandemic.
Having gained insight on where it all began, which has been so informative with your experiences from the beginning to what currently is now, let's talk about where the district is heading. Can you share with us the goals you all envision? Because even though, Mr. Tim, you might not be there, I'm sure you have your own goals that you want this school to continue forward. The goals that you envision, and what are the rising challenges that you aim to conquer? Because while you're still very successful, I'm sure there's some challenges that have risen, if any.
Yeah. Well, I can jump in and then let Troy follow up. I think there's a couple that I can think of. I think, I don't know that we're done yet with our evidence-based grading work. I think that's something that, although we've been implementing over the last, 5 to 10 years, I still think that there are many more opportunities for us to strengthen that work. And, really where, we want to continue to improve is how we're giving kids feedback. And is that feedback, actionable feedback that they can use, to improve their learning? And the other component of that is really around efficacy. We want students to feel like, they're part of that learning experience that's going on in the classroom. So the work around grading just continues to kind of unpack all these other opportunities that I don't know that we saw 10 years ago when we first started. 10 years ago, Troy, we just said, we want to get rid of the 100-point scale. We want to get rid of the zero. We want to get rid of all these grading practices that didn't make sense. But now we're starting to realize that when kids actually understand what those learning intentions are, now we can support them and help them grow in a multitude of different ways. So to me, that work just continues to be so exciting. And then the other area that we've really kind of doubled down on in the last 5 years is around social emotional learning. We hired a social emotional learning coordinator about 5 years ago. This year, we've hired a new director of social emotional learning. And that work just continues to pay dividends. I do think that it was integral to helping support kids through the pandemic. It just provides us with a lens to be more intentional about helping students grow. And I think that, to me, that, when you talk about, creating schools that produce good and smart kids, we have to really continue to focus on student social emotional learning. I remember my interview with Rick, even for the director position back in 1999, he asked me a question about data and about growth. And I remember at the time saying, geez, I just wish there was a way to measure student social emotional learning. And at the time, there was nothing like that. Well, now today, there's all kinds of tools that we're using. Many of them are self-assessments, but regardless, there are opportunities for kids to give us feedback on their SEL growth. And I've always felt like, if a kid gets a 36 on the ACT and has 12 AP exams, that's great. But if you wouldn't want to invite them over for Sunday dinner with your grandma, I'm not sure we've succeeded. You know what I mean? They need to be smart and good kids. And so I really do see those two things as kind of the next 10, 15 years of where we're heading, really improving our evidence-based grading practices and our social emotional learning growth. I don't know, Troy, if anything else jumps up for you.
Yeah, I just want to maybe give it more of a practical spin. So if you think about the work we were talking about with changing the way we give feedback because we thought differently about our grading practices, what that's done in our curricular team meetings is we've changed it's wonderful to watch them work to do collaborative scoring and really spend time with student work. And, often when you talk about, you think through professional learning communities, you think of, well, I've got a group of kids, here's some scores, and we're going to identify how we're going to help this group of kids based on where they've fallen in their scores. Fabulous. That's a wonderful thing to do. But I also think it's an amazing way to operate as a collaborative team, to sit down with real student data from different teachers, identify how would you grade this, what's important, what feedback should a kid get in space like this. Let's make sure we're giving consistent, growth and expectations. And like that's also part of the work. And it has that moving forward. And we're really just getting into it as we've gotten everyone into that evidence-based world. That I think is so powerful for our teams. And I'm excited for the future of that as it goes forward.
Yeah. And, Troy, what's interesting about what you're saying is that's a much deeper way of thinking about critical question 2, which is how will we know if they know it? Because it's funny, as an extension of that, in all the work I do, I challenge, it's not enough just to have a common assessment that's used in a formative way. You must think about the nature of the feedback and how do we provide that feedback and what makes good feedback and how do kids take action on it, right? And that idea that we would have a collaborative scoring kind of process as an obligation of the professional learning community is reasonably newer, and I think that by reasonably, I mean the last 5 or 6 years. And it's not necessarily a first order of business, but it is an order of business that can take your teacher team work as they're ready to begin to make that part of it. I think is really important. And I guess to answer the question about the future of Stevenson, as someone who gave 25 years of his life to the place and has a tremendous amount of ownership in it, I would say that, one of the hardest things for me, I still can remember, I have a message that I give called that I basically stole from someone else, but I talk about this idea of my entire life at Stevenson ended up in 7 boxes. And I put it in my truck and I drove off that campus in 2007, knowing I was never coming back, knowing that my seasons as they had stacked up were over, at least that part of my professional life, right? And it was very emotional. And yet I was also like, will anybody even remember me? 7 freaking boxes was my entire career of 25 years there. That was it. And it made me realize, like, it's not about remembering me as much as did I have any impact on the culture while I was there? Was I able to keep moving it forward? And when I listen to the two of you, I'm like, yes, you have. But I think you have a burden because from my perspective now as an outsider, I count on Stevenson as being a lighthouse for the rest of the nation. I count on Stevenson as being a place where the 1999 experience you had, Troy, will happen just as strongly for other people today, and even in a much more deeper way in terms of the things they witnessed than what perhaps we were at that stage 20 years ago. And I just feel like, that idea, I remember was one of my final conversations with Rick DuFour as he was leaving in 2002 was, what will we do to reach out, continue to be a lighthouse school for the greater community? And, and I just feel like that is still such a great aspect of the work forward that Stevenson still provides. And it doesn't matter whether you're elementary, middle, or high. I know it's a high school district, but the principles apply the same. And in fact, in some ways, separates more easily in elementary schools and districts than perhaps in high school districts. So, I just want to say that, I admire the fact that Stevenson and its community is willing to see itself as a lighthouse community for others. And that, my hope, Prisma, to answer your question directly, would be that it could be 20 years from now. And there might be someone still talking about, well, here's what happened back in 1990, but it'll be 20 years ago and 20 years from now. And there will be a new set of people, perhaps in this conversation, that will say, here's what we're doing today to keep it going. Yeah. That to me is the hope.
Well, and I think that, it's so interesting about what you said, Tim, because I think the real leadership challenge for all of us has been, how do you continue to push that continuous improvement flywheel and make yourself expendable at the same time? Because that, in my mind, is really the goal, right? We don't,
Yep.
I mean, if Rick had left here and things fell apart, he would have said, I knew him well, he would have said he was a failure then, and so, and you feel the same way as I do and Troy does, that, pushing that flywheel of continuous improvement and making ourselves expendable, in my mind, is the real paradox of leading schools like this. And I think that's something that, we feel passionate about is, the day we leave, we're confident it'll continue to get better because we're gone. Just to be clear, Troy, I think right now we only have you with 5 boxes. So
yeah, I don't even know that I have that.
Yeah, I don't. Yeah.
You reminded me, Tim, though, of one of the most memorable evenings of that I've ever had. It was about six months into being the principal here at Stevenson, and Rick and Becky DuFour flew here to meet me. And we went out to dinner with Eric and our wives. And what was so impactful in that conversation, I had known Rick, I'd met him a couple of times in passing, but when we sat down to talk about our work with Stevenson, it was the legacy that he provided and just how much he loved this place.
Yes.
And it was so meaningful to sit there and talk to him about it. And, I don't know why Eric ever decided to hire me. That's an interesting question, but I do think one of the things that I brought when I showed up was sort of this, like, I had just helped build a professional learning community at a different school. And when I walked in, I'm like, you know what, there's some ways that we could be better at the collaboration that we do. And you imagine this school where people are like, well, that's Stevenson. But I think what's so powerful is the work is never done. And I don't know that it's natural to collaborate at a high level like we expect people to do. And you have to keep pressure on all the time. You have to keep reminding people of what the work is, because I think isolation is almost like the default. People kind of slide back into their own space. And so I like to think that the one thing I brought when I arrived was I was able to say, hey, let's not forget the core principles and keep pushing us back into that work. And so that conversation with Rick really sticks out to me. And then the second part of the day, and we haven't really even spoken of her yet, but it was obvious when we sat around, the 6 of us were sitting around, and I realized that Becky was probably the most talented educator in the room. She was absolutely incredible. And that will forever be a very special day for me.
That's really cool. I love hearing that, Troy. Yeah, absolutely. She was an exceptional woman.
Yep.
No, I was just going to say that, what you made me think of, Troy, is, that idea of relentless pressure gently applied, that to me is the continuous improvement mantra, But.
Well, thank you so much for such a powerful conversation. It's been so informative, and it's just been an honor to just be here, learn from you. I've been learning a lot in this actual interview. So thank you so much to all of you for your insights and your expertise on PLC.
Thank you, Prisma.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. It's been great to be with you. Thank you. Thanks for doing this, you guys.
Thank you.
It's fun.
It's been fun.
To learn more about their strategies and data on becoming a model PLC district, navigate to www.allthingsplc.info. Then at the top, click on See the Evidence and search for Adlai E Stevenson High School, where you can also use the filters and look through the options to find a school or district similar to yours. Also, to learn more about our Solution Tree associates, and then also to request their professional development guidance, go to solutiontree.com, search for their name, and on that page, you can make your request. Now for our sponsor message here from the company. At Solution Tree, we share your vision to transform education to ensure learning for all, and we can help you make this vision a reality. No other professional learning company provides our unique blend of research-based, results-driven services that improve learning outcomes for our students. All right, we appreciate you tuning in. Make sure to navigate to our solutiontree.com/podcast page to listen to our other episodes. There you can subscribe to our podcast today. Just click on the subscribe button, and then you can select your favorite podcast app. Also, remember to like our episodes and subscribe to our YouTube channel. This has been your host, Prisma Lopez-Marin. Thank you for joining us for Charting New Paths in Pre-K-12 Education.